The youth of today. 'Twas ever thus, guys. And I want to say something about young people because this is a really important period in the history of young people. Now, as a starter here, there are two ways of addressing you lot. Youth, or young people. If you're youths, you're vandalising phone boxes or creating mayhem or having parties when you shouldn't. If you're young people, you're doing education, you're being nice to your elders, you're being respectable and respectful. Okay? And we're going to look at some various aspects of youth and young people. So we'll start with young people. And in many ways, it's often seen that the early 50s was the period where we had our young people. Well, I've mentioned before the idea of the land of lost content, where son and daughter knew their place, where they were respectful, where they actually, in many ways, looked quite a lot like their parents. I think my mum and dad were a large extent like that, to be frank with you. And there is a truism in the cliche that people, particularly young people in the early 50s, were looking above all else to set themselves up, to make their futures, to be respectable. Now, version 2 in this period is youth. Now, we mentioned Teddy Boys. This was a fashion that results from rock and roll music coming in the mid-50s, and they dressed in a sort of quasi-Edwardian fashion with like quiffed up hair. They had like long jackets on, blue suede shoes or whatever, famously, and often flip knives and a tasty fight, right? And a bit of racism to throw in as well. And Teddy Boys were seen as the latest youth threat. Wasn't like that in the Victorian times. It was, by the way. The word hooligan actually comes from Victorian times. But it was seen as a national threat. Well, that version of the national threat of 56, 7, turned into the version of the national threat of 63, 64 with mods and rockers. Rockers were in many ways their latter day Teddy Boys. They were people who liked their rock and roll, and they often drove motorbikes, whereas mods drove scooters and wore sharp suits and got into soul music, even a bit of jazz, and later then into some rather more modern rock music, often called mod music. These were young people we do not approve of, and we do not like, and we need to clamp down upon. I'll say something about home secretaries and that in a minute. Version 3, the young people in this period, were the angry young men. These were people who wrote plays, okay, and we'll mention them in a minute. Or kitchen sink dramas was another word, or satire. These were, if you like, the young people who were setting out a different way from what had come before. Version 4 of you lot might well be nice boys and screaming girls. I'm really thinking of Cliff and Beatlemania. Now, Cliff, of course, was the great first British rock and roll star, and he was a nice boy. And so were the Beatles to start with. They were very nice chaps. And lots of girls fell in love with them and got massively excited about them. Actually, version 5 turned out to be closer to the truth, which was, of course, I'm quoting the Stones song here, I Can't Get No Satisfaction. And it was slightly less nice boys. Boys your mummy and daddy wouldn't like, and especially your daddy wouldn't like if you were a girl. I think the true story could be summed up actually by not the Beatles' first LP, A La Larkin we've discussed before, but the Beatles' second LP, which features on it the song Money. Because the real truth of what's going on here is young people for the first time had a disposable income. They had money to spend, and they were looking for stuff to spend it on. Meanwhile, a lot of stuff is talked about cultural change in this period related to as a new wave of younger thinkers. Dominic Sandbrook nicknames them the provincial all-stars because a lot of them, I think, came from the provinces rather than being London. So Kingsley Amis, famous book Lucky Jim, Philip Larkin. And they turned, I think, quite deliberately against the sort of modernism of the 30s and stuff. And they were into trad jazz and everything else. Sadly, I think Larkin and Kingsley Amis were also pretty into being hating foreigners and becoming racist. One example I love in this period is a guy called Colin Wilson who wrote a book called The Outsider. It's utterly unreadable. I have actually tried. One critic described it as puerile pontification and fatuous polemic. I think that's being kind. He said, I suspect I'm probably the greatest writer of the 20th century. He wasn't. But what he represented was something of the idea of rejecting an established order. This is the period of art schools. We'll mention something about this later on, but jazz, blues, the folk revival, skiffle. This is where the likes of John Lennon or Keith Richards and Mick Jagger come from. They come from this kind of background, art schooly kind of background. That's a force for social change, I think, as well among younger people. And we shouldn't overdo the provincials, by the way. The big satire boom in this period, well, they were all Oxbridge, pretty much. Almost all university, they were Oxford and Cambridge people. Then there were the angry young men. The classic example is John Osborne, whose famous play Look Back in Anger was seen to be reacting against the well-made plays of Terence Rattigan or Noel Coward. Even Osborne admitted that Look Back in Anger is actually quite an old-fashioned play. Compare it to, say, Bertolt Brecht or Samuel Beckett, it certainly is. His next play was actually written for that great force of the British theatrical establishment, Laurence Olivier, but he's actually a far more radical play than Don't Look Back in Anger. New Wave came into cinema as well, and there's some great films, actually. Taste of Honey, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. They were important films. They were tracing a different kind of British life, a working class life, a tough working class life, a realistic working class life. But don't overdo it. Most people prefer James Bond. I suspect most of you would prefer James Bond. And of course, Sean Connery was the big new British star, hardly noted for his new wave or anger. I think the biggest cultural change of this period was young people. In the early 50s, the crooners, Eddie Fisher, my mum loved Eddie Fisher, God, he was awful. Doris Day, my dad loved Doris Day, and she was pretty awful as well. They crooned ballads, were pretty much like those of the 30s, and people wore sharp suits and snazzy dresses, just as they had done before. The real change was Elvis and rock and roll. The likes of the Little Richards, the Eddie Cochrans, they completely change it. In retrospect, even they're not quite so revolutionary. Bill Haley, who had, I think, often recognised as first big rock and roll hit with Rock Around the Clock, was actually his 40s, I think, at the time. Certainly was middle-aged. Elvis, after being a bit radical, joins the army and is a nice chap and makes terrible movies thereafter. And Britain's first rock and roll stars are Cliff Richard, who was, wanted to be a nice chap and was very nice to his mum and came from my dad's village in Nazing, and he was very nice to his mum, was Harry Webb. And a chirpy cockney called Tommy Steele, whose real confessed ambition was to become an all-round entertainer, just like the generation before him. Like their stars, I think, what most British teenagers wanted was to buy stuff and have a bit of fun and then settle down like mummy and daddy. But then things did change. The 60s did come, and John, Paul, George and Ringo, well, they were nice boys, but they then became something rather different. That's the next bit of the story, because we all know sexual intercourse began in 1963. And that is going to be one of the themes when we look at the 60s, the permissive society, the social revolution that comes in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Not really, truth be told, in the 50s, which was just the warm-up act.